Why men are turning away. You see it more and more now. Men who have everything society told them to strive for. Steady careers, good health, financial security, even respect in their communities. And yet when it comes to marriage, they're walking away as if it were a fire about to consume them. These are not broken men, not failures, not men who couldn't find love. These are men who looked at the numbers, weighed the odds, and realized that what once seemed like a sacred union now resembles a rigged contract. Everyone knows the headline statistic. A little over half of marriages end in divorce. But that's the polite number. That's the figure that helps everyone sleep at night, the one trotted out to make it seem like a coin toss. What few are willing to admit is that if you factor in the couples who remain together only for the children, the mortgage, or because the thought of starting over at 50 feels like a death sentence, the real failure rate climbs closer to 3 out of 4. In other words, the majority of marriages are either shattered or silently decaying. Fyodor Dostoevsky once wrote, "The best way to keep a prisoner from escaping is to make sure he never knows he's in prison." And isn't that exactly the fate of so many men who stay in hollow unions, convincing themselves they are free while the walls close in? Men today are beginning to recognize this for what it is. They see friends stripped bare in family courts, fathers reduced to visitors in their children's lives, men carrying decades of debt for the privilege of being told when and how they can see their own offspring. They see their fathers who worked until their last breath, not to live freely, but to keep paying for a family that shut them out. This is not hatred of women. It is not an inability to commit. It is simply acknowledging that the risk-to-reward ratio has become so lopsided that only a fool would sign such a contract without hesitation. But here's the paradox that should stop anyone cold. Nearly 9 out of 10 divorced people remarry within 5 years. Pause for a moment. Think about the insanity of that. Men and women alike, having just crawled out of emotional hell, torn apart financially, sometimes forced to split their children between 2 homes like property, and yet they return. They go back to the very system that broke them. Why? Because they believe the most expensive lie in human history. This time, it's different. It is never different. It is the same game with a different face, the same signature on the same contract, the same fragile promises wrapped in fresh music and flowers. It's not unlike the gambler who loses his house in Las Vegas and walks straight back to the roulette table with his last paycheck, convinced that the wheel owes him. Anyone watching from the outside can see the delusion, but when you're the one at the table, you call it hope. And so the cycle repeats. Break, remarry, break again. Each round strips more from the soul, more from the bank account, and more from the children caught in the crossfire. The script society hands men from birth, insists that marriage is the finish line, the badge of honor that proves manhood. Mothers still ask when their sons will settle down, as if bachelorhood is some kind of disease. Friends post smiling wedding photos as though they've won the Olympics. Every film seems to fade to black on a wedding kiss, never showing the decades that follow. What no one asks is what happens when those decades unravel. Men are finally daring to ask the forbidden question. Maybe the problem is not finding the right person at all. Maybe the problem is the structure itself. Maybe the institution has evolved into something so dangerous, so one-sided, that the smartest move is simply to walk away. And here's the hook most men miss until it's too late. If the game is designed for you to lose, what does it matter how good you are at playing? This is not cynicism, it's awakening. It is the moment when you realize that romance, no matter how intoxicating, cannot erase the economic and legal realities behind it. And once that realization sets in, you begin to see what was invisible before. Every vow, every celebration, every honeymoon suddenly reveals itself as the opening act of a performance with a legal contract hiding behind the curtain. And yet the pressure to comply is immense. Whole industries depend on it. Jewelers, wedding planners, divorce lawyers. Entire cultural myths are built around it. The notion that a man is incomplete until he has taken this step. But men are breaking the spell. They are beginning to look not through the lens of romance, but through the harsh clarity of contract law. And what they see when the illusions are stripped away is a deal that no rational person would sign. This recognition is spreading, quietly but powerfully. You'll notice it in conversations at bars, in the way men speak after a few drinks when honesty spills out. You'll see it in the young man who looks at his older colleague drained by custody battles and silently vows never to end up the same way. The veil is lifting. The real question is not why men no longer want to get married. The real question is why for so long they believed they had to. And once you begin pulling at that thread, a deeper and more unsettling truth emerges, one that goes beyond the pain of failed relationships and into the heart of how society has conditioned every one of us since childhood. Because marriage was never just about love. It never has been. It was always about something much colder, much more permanent. And to see that truth, you must be willing to look past the flowers and music into the ledger books where the real story lies. From the very beginning, you were taught a story. Fairy tales told you that true love conquers all. Every children's movie ended with a wedding. Every cultural signal equated marriage with a rival. Even now, friends post carefully staged engagement photos like they've discovered a treasure chest, while families still ask the same loaded question, when will you settle down? From childhood onward, you were trained to believe that marriage is the summit of adulthood, that a man without a ring is unfinished. But what if that story was always a mask? What if beneath the music and the smiles lies something far older, colder, and far more transactional? Anthropologists will tell you that for thousands of years, marriage was not about love. It was about economics. It was about property, inheritance, and alliances between families. The idea of marrying for passion, of binding your life to another person because of a fleeting chemical rush, is astonishingly new, barely a century old. Nietzsche once observed, "Love is a state in which a man sees things most decidedly as they are not." When you apply that insight to modern marriage, it explains why so many walk in with stars in their eyes and wake up years later realizing they've signed away their future. Strip marriage of its poetry and it becomes a contract, nothing more, nothing less. And like all contracts, it should be read carefully. Yet most men sign without ever knowing the terms. They place half their assets, their income, and even custody of their children on the table, wagering it all on the hope that emotions that science has shown have an expiration date, will never change. Ask yourself, in what other area of life would you take that bet? Would you invest your savings in a stock that has a 75% chance of collapsing? Would you hand over control of your business to someone who might wake up tomorrow and decide they're no longer interested? Of course not. Yet men do exactly this when they marry without understanding the legal and economic framework. The truth is that every relationship has always been an exchange of value. Pretending otherwise is not purity, it's delusion. Take the example of an older, wealthy man with a younger woman. Outsiders whisper gold digger as if they've uncovered corruption. But what they overlook is that both parties understand the transaction. He brings resources, stability, wisdom. She brings youth, vitality, beauty. Both receive something they desire. There is more honesty in that arrangement than in the marriage where both insist money doesn't matter, all while silently keeping score every time the bills are paid. The real danger is not the exchange, it is the blindness. The man who convinces himself that she loves him solely for his personality, ignoring the financial backdrop. The woman who convinces herself that passion will sustain her even as resentment grows over who contributes what. At least when you buy or sell openly, you know the terms. But when you wrap financial realities in the veil of romance, you set the stage for disillusionment. As Schopenhauer put it, love, in its essence, is but the will to the continuation of the species. Once the biological drive fades, what remains is negotiation. Negotiation most men are unprepared for. This is why the analogy to gambling is so apt. Men are not merely playing for affection, they are playing for survival. Yet they are told not to look at the chips on the table. They are told to close their eyes and bet everything, because real love requires faith. But faith is a dangerous currency in contracts. In contracts, only terms matter. And this is why modern marriage so often devastates men with resources. Love becomes the lure, but the hook is legal and financial. Consider how society frames the bachelor. A man without a wife is portrayed as selfish, immature, unfinished. But what society rarely admits is how often the married man is the one truly unfinished, sacrificing his freedom and vitality to uphold appearances. Think of the colleague who suddenly stops traveling because every trip means an argument. Think of the friend whose career ambitions shrink to avoid conflict at home. These are the invisible costs, the erosion of spirit that never makes it into statistics. And still, men are pushed into this with promises that romance will solve everything. But ask yourself, if marriage were truly about love, why does the state need to be involved at all? Why must a government document validate your affection? Why do lawyers and judges determine how your children will be raised if it falls apart? If love were truly enough, why would any of this machinery exist? The uncomfortable truth is that marriage was never primarily about love. It was about control, property, and obligations. Only in recent times has it been rebranded as a love story, and men are beginning to see the cracks in that branding. They are beginning to understand that emotions and economics cannot be separated, that happily ever after is not a safeguard against custody hearings and asset division. And once this understanding takes root, the next question becomes unavoidable. If marriage is a contract dressed up in flowers and vows, why not write your own terms instead of letting the state dictate them? Insurance for love, not betrayal. This is where most men flinch. The moment the word prenup enters the conversation, the air changes, faces harden, romance curdles, and suddenly love feels conditional. Yet this reaction itself reveals the very problem. A prenup is not planning for divorce any more than life insurance is planning to die. It is a safeguard against a reality that statistics prove is far too common to ignore. Pretending otherwise does not protect you. It only makes the fall harder when it comes. Think of the way you live your life in every other domain. You wear a seatbelt, not because you plan on crashing, but because you accept that crashes happen. You buy home insurance, not because you expect a fire, but because the possibility exists. And yet when it comes to marriage, a decision that has higher odds of failure than most investments, men are shamed for even considering protection. Why? Because acknowledging risk strips away the fantasy, and fantasy is what most people cling to. The truth is that a prenup is the most adult conversation two people can have before pledging a life together. It is the moment where illusions are set aside and reality is acknowledged. Yours, mine, ours. What you bring in remains yours, what I bring in remains mine, and what we build together is shared. Simple, honest, fair. Yet for most couples, this clarity is unbearable. They would rather sign a blank check to the state than admit that their relationship, like all relationships, may not last forever. History teaches us that when we ignore the terms of a contract, we are dragged by them. Seneca wrote, "Fate leads the willing and drags along the reluctant." And isn't that what happens to men in family courts? They never read the contract, never considered the terms, and when the day of reckoning arrives, they are dragged through alimony, through custody battles, through years of servitude, all because they refused to prepare when love blinded them. But here is the paradox that most miss. Prenups do not kill romance, they enhance it. Because when you know you can leave, yet you choose to stay, that is love in its purest form. When you are not bound by fear of financial ruin, every day together becomes a conscious choice, not an economic necessity. This is the difference between captivity and freedom. A bird in a cage may sing, but the song is meaningless. A bird that stays when the door is open is expressing something real. Research into human psychology confirms what men feel intuitively, the intense chemical rush of new love, what psychologists call limerence, fades within 18 to 48 months. After that, relationships are no longer sustained by biology but by compatibility, honesty, and shared values. Without agreements in place, what follows is often resentment, arguments over money, and eventually collapse. But a prenup forces the conversations that most couples postpone until it is too late. What happens if one of us stops working? What happens if one inherits wealth? What if, God forbid, we fall out of love? These are not negative questions. They are responsible ones. Real stories illustrate the stakes more vividly than any philosophy. Consider the businessman who built his company from nothing, only to lose half of it in a divorce settlement, forced to sell shares and hand control to outsiders just to meet obligations. Or the father who lost custody of his children, condemned to see them on alternating weekends, while still paying the mortgage on the house he no longer lived in. These are not anomalies. They are the silent reality for countless men, men whose names will never be known, but whose suffering is etched into every courtroom in every city. Contrast this with the rare men who insisted on clarity. One man, ridiculed by his fiance's friends for demanding a prenup, signed it anyway. Years later, when the marriage ended, both walked away intact, dignity preserved, resources untouched beyond what they built together. There was pain, but not devastation. The agreement had turned what could have been war into separation with respect. And that is the point most miss. A prenup is not protection against love. It is protection against what love becomes when filtered through courts and contracts. It transforms the bond from one of obligation into one of choice. It ensures that even if the worst happens, both can walk away without being annihilated. But here lies the deeper tragedy. Most men will never even consider it. They will allow tears, guilt, or the accusation of mistrust to silence them. They will sign their lives away in the haze of romance, never realizing that the very conversation they avoided was the one that could have saved them. And if this sounds grim, ask yourself, what about the men who never make it to divorce court? The ones who remain trapped in lifeless marriages year after year? What becomes of them when walking away means financial suicide? Not every man ends up in the courtroom. Many never file for divorce at all, and yet they are no less destroyed. These are the hidden casualties, the men who stay because leaving would mean losing everything they've worked for. They are the men you see going through the motions day after day, outwardly committed but inwardly hollow. They stay because of the children, because of the mortgage, because starting over at 45 with half their assets gone feels like drowning in open water. They are not husbands anymore. They are inmates serving out a sentence. You can recognize them if you look closely. The man who works late every night, not because he loves his job, but because the office feels freer than his own home. The one who develops a drinking habit, not because he is weak, but because it numbs the weight of a loveless union. The one who swallows antidepressants, not because he has a chemical imbalance, but because he is trapped in an arrangement that would depress anyone. They once signed up for intimacy, and what they received instead was obligation. They signed up for partnership, but what they were handed was servitude, and society, blind to their quiet suffering, calls them responsible men. Here lies the cruel irony. These men are not counted in divorce statistics. On paper, they are success stories. Their marriages are intact. They are used as examples of stability. Yet beneath the surface, their dreams are gone, their spirit diminished, their lives reduced to endurance. The tragedy is not only their own, but their children's as well. For children measure love not by ceremonies, but by stability. And when stability becomes a prison, the cycle of resentment is passed down to the next generation. So what are the benefits of marriage today when weighed against this cost? Decades ago, marriage offered tangible advantages: social acceptance, career advancement, legitimacy for children, regular companionship. Today, every one of those benefits can be found outside the contract. Society no longer ostracizes bachelors. Career discrimination against unmarried men is illegal. Intimacy is more accessible outside of marriage than within it for most. And domestic support? Most modern marriages are dual-income households where both partners are too exhausted to provide the comforts of old. What remains? Love. And love does not require a government stamp to exist. This is why the narrative that men are afraid of commitment rings so hollow. Men are still committing. They are still loving, still building relationships, still raising children. They are simply refusing to sign a contract that transforms love into liability. They are not running from responsibility. They are running from a deal that no longer makes sense, and that distinction is vital. It is the difference between cowardice and wisdom. Of course, when men make this choice, society fights back with shame. They are called bitter, misogynistic, damaged. But look at who is walking away. Not only the divorced, scarred men, but also successful bachelors, men thriving in careers, men building wealth, men living with freedom. They are not broken, they are rational. They have read the fine print and chosen not to sign. And here's the part few dare to say out loud: the system is not failing. It is functioning exactly as designed. Divorce courts, custody battles, endless legal fees. These are not accidents. They are revenue streams. The longer the conflict, the higher the profits. Judges, lawyers, therapists, real estate agents, they all feed on the carcass of failed marriages. Every custody hearing, every property sale, every mandated counseling session means money in someone else's pocket. The family court system is not a guardian of fairness. It is a machine built for extraction, and men are the primary resource it processes. So when men refuse to marry, it is not an act of rebellion against women. It is an act of self-defense against an institution that profits from their destruction. They are choosing reality over fantasy. They are choosing autonomy over entrapment. And they are redefining masculinity not as the willingness to sacrifice blindly, but as the courage to say no to a rigged game. Marriage, as it stands, demands too much and offers too little. It asks men to wager their future, their freedom, their children, on odds that no sane investor would accept. Until that changes, until the contract is rewritten to reflect fairness, men will keep walking away. And perhaps that is not a crisis at all. Perhaps it is evolution. Perhaps it is the moment when men finally realize that their worth is not measured by their willingness to sign a piece of paper, but by their ability to live with clarity, dignity, and freedom. So if these words resonate with you, if they echo the unease you've felt but never spoken, remember this: you are not alone. Men everywhere are beginning to see what you see. Share this truth with those who need it. Think of the man silently suffering in a home he no longer recognizes, or the young man about to walk blindly into a contract he doesn't understand. Let him hear this before it's too late. Love will endure without a contract. Commitment will endure without a judge. What cannot endure is blindness. The game has changed. The risks are clear, and men have noticed. The only question that remains is whether you will face this truth now, or whether you will wait until it is your turn in front of the judge.